She was hired to ruin him. Not loudly, not with scandal or public accusation or the dramatic machinery of social destruction that lesser people reached for when they wanted someone gone. She was hired quietly, by quiet people with quiet money, to do what she had done 3 times before in 3 different cities without leaving a single fingerprint behind. Find his weakness, find his secret, and find the price at which a man like the Duke of Varnmore would rather pay than be exposed. She had accepted the commission without hesitation. She had made one mistake. She had not asked why they were so afraid of him. Before we go any further, welcome to the Duke Obsession. Every week we bring you stories of power, secrets, and the moment everything reverses. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Now, back to her first mistake. Maren Cole was 27 years old and had been, since the age of 19, the most discreet and effective information broker in London. She did not call herself that. She had no title, no office, no calling card. She existed in the space between what powerful people knew and what they needed to know, and she moved through that space with the particular ease of a woman who had learned very early that invisibility was not a limitation, but a weapon. She had grown up the daughter of a forger, a talented, reckless man who had taught her everything about the gap between appearance and reality before disappearing into a debtor's prison when she was 15 and dying there 2 years later. What he had left her, besides an education in deception and a complete absence of sentimentality, was a single piece of advice she had carried like a compass ever since. He had said, "Maren, every powerful man has one thing he cannot afford to lose. Find that thing, and you will never be powerless again." She had spent 10 years finding things. She was very good at it. The commission regarding the Duke of Varnmore had come through her usual intermediary, a solicitor named Mr. Fitch, who asked no questions and expected the same courtesy in return. The client wished to remain anonymous, the fee was generous, the brief was simple. The Duke of Varnmore, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in England, was blocking a significant business arrangement that certain parties considered essential. He had refused to negotiate, refused to sell, refused to be persuaded by any conventional means. The parties in question believed he was concealing something that properly understood would give them the leverage they needed. They wanted to know what it was. Maren had taken the money and begun her work. She had spent 2 weeks reading everything that had ever been written about Alaric Vos, the Duke of Varnmore. Society columns, estate records, parliamentary debates in which his name appeared, the single biography that had been attempted and abandoned halfway through, its author reportedly having decided that the subject was, quote, impenetrable and not in an interesting way. What she had found was this. He was 33, he had inherited the title at 25 from a father who had left the estate in significant debt, which the Duke had methodically resolved over 8 years through what appeared to be a combination of exceptional financial management and an almost total absence of personal expenditure. He did not gamble, he did not maintain a mistress, he attended the minimum number of social engagements required to maintain his position and left each one at the earliest possible moment. He had a younger sister, Lady Cecily, who lived at Varnmore Park and was by all accounts the only person in England for whom the Duke demonstrated anything resembling warmth. He had no known enemies. This, Maren had noted, was the most suspicious thing about him. Every powerful man had enemies. A man with no known enemies was a man who had been very careful about who he allowed to become one. She had designed her approach with care. She would present herself as a writer, a respectable fiction she had used before, researching a social history of the great estates of England. She would request a brief interview, she would observe, she would leave and return and observe again, and in the accumulation of small details that people revealed when they believed they were not being studied, she would find what she was looking for. She had arranged an introduction through a mutual acquaintance. She had arrived at Varnmore Park on a Tuesday morning in October. She had been shown in to the Duke's study, and the Duke of Varnmore had looked up from his desk and looked at her and said, "Miss Cole, I was wondering when you would arrive." She had been wrong-footed precisely once in 10 years of this work. This was the second time. She kept her expression neutral. She said, "Your Grace, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." He said, "Sit down." She sat. She took the measure of him quickly, the way she always did, cataloging details before the subject had time to arrange themselves for observation. He was tall, with dark hair, and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber, warm in color and cold in everything else. His face was the kind that gave nothing away, not because it was trained to hide things, but because it simply never developed the habit of offering them. He was looking at her the same way she was looking at him. She said, "I understand you have agreed to speak with me about the history of Varnmore Park." He said, "I agreed to meet you. I did not agree to discuss the house." She said, "What did you agree to discuss?" He said, "I thought we might begin with who sent you." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October wind moved through the grounds. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked with the steady patience of something that had been keeping time in this room for longer than either of them had been alive. She said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Miss Cole, I have been expecting someone for approximately 3 weeks. My associate in London informed me that a certain firm of solicitors," he named the firm, Mr. Fitch's firm, precisely, had been making inquiries on behalf of an anonymous client. He paused. "You are the 4th person they have sent to this house. The previous 3 were less subtle." She said, "I was not sent by anyone. I am a writer researching—" He said, "You are not a writer." He said it without heat, without accusation, simply as a fact being stated for the record. "You are, if my information is correct, an information broker of considerable skill, who has worked for 3 different clients in the past 2 years, obtaining leverage material against men who were inconvenient to certain business interests." He looked at her steadily. "You are also, if my information is correct, the best at what you do, which is why they sent you last." Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your information is correct." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, something closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who has been waiting for an honest conversation and has finally been given one. He said, "I appreciate that." She said, "It does not change why I am here." He said, "No, but it changes how we might discuss it." He leaned back in his chair. "Miss Cole, the people who hired you believe I am concealing something. They are correct, I am. But what I am concealing is not what they think it is, and if they knew what it actually was, they would not be able to use it in the way they intend." She said, "What is it?" He said, "I will tell you, but not today." He stood. "Stay for dinner. I will have Mrs. Alderton prepare a room if you wish to remain overnight. Tomorrow morning I will show you something that will answer every question you have been sent here to answer, and several you have not thought to ask yet." She should have left. Every instinct she had developed over 10 years told her to stand up, walk out, and report back to Mr. Fitch that the subject was aware and the commission was compromised. She said, "All right." She did not entirely understand why. Dinner at Varnmore was unlike any dinner Maren had attended in the course of her work. There was no performance, no careful arrangement of silver and flowers designed to impress. The dining room was large, but the table had been set at one end for 2, informally, with good food and a fire, and none of the ceremonial distance that great houses usually maintained between host and guest. Lady Cecily joined them. She was 22, with her brother's amber eyes and none of his reserve. She had clearly been told who Maren was, or some version of it, because she sat down across from her with the expression of someone who found the situation considerably more interesting than alarming. She said, "Alaric says you are very good at finding things out about people." Maren said, "I try to be." Cecily said, "What have you found out about him?" Alaric said, "Cecily." Cecily said, "I am asking on her behalf. She has been hired to find your weakness. She should know if she is getting warm." Maren looked at the Duke. He was looking at his sister with an expression that was as close to fond exasperation as she suspected his face was capable of producing. He said, "She is not getting warm. She has not started looking yet." Cecily said to Maren, "He does not have the weaknesses people think he has. No secrets, no scandal, no hidden vice." She paused. "He does have one weakness, but it is not the kind you can use against him." Maren said, "What kind is it?" Cecily looked at her brother. He was looking at his wine-glass. Cecily said, "The inconvenient kind." The conversation moved on, but Maren filed it away, the way she filed everything, precisely, without commentary, for later examination. After dinner, Alaric walked her through the portrait gallery. He did this without being asked, as though it were a natural extension of the evening, pointing out ancestors with the dry, brief observations of a man who had grown up with these faces and long since stopped being impressed by them. He stopped before one portrait near the end of the gallery. It was a woman, perhaps 30, painted with the informal ease of someone who had sat for the portrait willingly rather than out of obligation. She had dark hair and a quality of stillness that reminded Maren, with a small shock of recognition, of herself. He said, "My mother." Maren said, "She is beautiful." He said, "She was. She died when Cecily was 4. He paused. "She was also, for the last 6 years of her life, entirely at the mercy of a man who used everything she loved as a means of controlling her." He said it quietly, without drama, as though he were reporting a fact from a history book rather than his own life. He said, "My father was not a cruel man in the obvious way. He was subtle. He understood that the most effective control is the kind the other person does not recognize as control." He paused. "I spent a great deal of my childhood watching my mother try to find a way out of something she could not name." Maren said nothing. She was watching him the way she watched everything, with her full attention, which she had learned long ago was the rarest gift one person could give another, and the most reliable way to make them tell you the truth. He said, "I tell you this not because it is relevant to what you were sent here to find. It is not. I tell you because I want you to understand something about why I am the way I am before tomorrow morning." She said, "Why does it matter that I understand?" He looked at her then, directly, with those amber eyes that were warm in color and had, she realized, been considerably warmer all evening than they had been in the study that morning. He said, "I am not sure yet, but I find that it does." He took her to the east wing at 9 in the morning. It was a part of the house she had not seen, older than the main building, connected by a covered walkway that smelled of stone and old wood and the particular cold of spaces that were used but not inhabited. Inside was a schoolroom. Not an ordinary schoolroom, a large, bright space with long tables and good light and shelves of books and materials that Maren recognized with some confusion as far more extensive and current than any private schoolroom she had encountered. There were perhaps 20 children present, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15, working with focused attention at their various tasks. 2 teachers moved between the tables. The children were not the children of the estate. She could see that immediately. Their clothing was clean, but not the clothing of privilege. Their faces had the particular quality of children who had learned early that the world was not arranged for their comfort and decided to pay attention anyway. She said, "Who are they?" He said, "Children from the village and the surrounding farms, families who cannot afford schooling." He paused. "There are 43 of them currently. We started with 11 4 years ago." She said, "You run a school?" He said, "I fund a school. Mrs. Alderton's daughter teaches the younger ones. Mr. Rowe handles mathematics and the older students." She said, "This is what you are concealing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I do not understand. This is," she searched for the word, "this is generous. Why would you hide it?" He said, "Because the people who hired you to come here are the same people whose business interests depend on keeping the families in this valley exactly where they are, uneducated, without options, without the ability to understand the contracts they sign, or the terms they are offered, or the alternatives available to them." He paused. 43 children, Miss Cole. I will not have 43 children's educations made into a bargaining chip." Maren stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and watched a girl of perhaps 8 years old bent over a copybook with the fierce concentration of someone who understood that what she was learning mattered, and felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. Something that had no professional use whatsoever. She said, "You knew I would not use this against you." He said, "I hoped you would not. I did not know." She said, "Why did you show me at all?" He was quiet for a moment. A boy near the window looked up from his work, noticed the Duke, and gave him a small nod that the Duke returned with the ease of long familiarity, before the boy went back to his copybook. The Duke said, "Because I am tired of being known as dangerous." He said it simply. "Because the people in this valley know what I actually am, and the people outside it know only the version that is useful to my enemies. And I find," he paused, "I find I would like at least one more person to know the truth of it." She said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you are the best at finding things out, and you found this, and you are still standing here." She went back to London that afternoon. She met with Mr. Fitch in his office on Thursday and told him that the commission was closed. Mr. Fitch said, "You found nothing?" She said, "I found everything." She paused. "I am returning the fee." Mr. Fitch stared at her. In 10 years she had never returned a fee. She said, "Tell your client that the Duke of Varnmore has no weakness they can use. Tell them that if they attempt to interfere with his affairs through any other means, the information I have gathered about their own arrangements over the past 2 weeks will find its way to people who will find it very interesting indeed." She set a folder on his desk. She said, "I am not difficult to hire, but I am very difficult to use against someone who does not deserve it." She left. She had spent 10 years finding the things that powerful men could not afford to lose. She had found, in a schoolroom on the east side of Varnmore Park, the one thing she had not expected. Something she could not afford to walk away from either. The clients, 3 men, she had identified them during her 2 weeks of work, partners in a land development enterprise that depended entirely on the ignorance and powerlessness of the valley's inhabitants, made their move 4 weeks later. They sent a letter to the Duke informing him that they were aware of the school and intended to bring it to the attention of certain authorities who would find the arrangement, an unmarried Duke funding an unsupervised education of local children, to be of questionable propriety. It was not a strong threat, but it did not need to be. In the world they operated in, suggestion was sufficient. Impropriety did not need to be real to be damaging. The Duke received the letter on a Monday. On Tuesday morning, before he had decided how to respond, 3 things arrived simultaneously. The first was a notice in the London Gazette, a full page, paid for in advance, describing the Varnmore Educational Foundation in precise and glowing detail, including the names of all 43 current students, the 2 teachers, and the Duke as its founder and primary benefactor. The second was a letter from the bishop of the county offering his formal endorsement of the school and his intention to visit in the spring. The third was a personal note, unsigned, that said only, "The best defense against suggestion is the truth, stated loudly before your enemies can whisper it. I learned that from a forger. It turns out to be universally applicable." The Duke read the note 3 times. He sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he called for his horse. He rode to London that afternoon. She was in her rooms when the knock came. She opened the door. He was still in his riding clothes, which meant he had come directly without stopping, which meant she had approximately 3 seconds before she said something she had not yet decided whether she meant. He said, "The note." She said, "I told you, I learned it from my father." He said, "You protected the school." She said, "I protected 43 children. You happened to be attached to them." He said, "Maren." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land the way names land when someone has been thinking them for longer than they have been saying them. She said, "I am not good at this. I want you to know that before you say whatever you came here to say. I find things out about people for money. I have spent 10 years being the person in the room that no one sees. I am not—" She stopped. "I am not the kind of person that people like you—" He said, "People like me." She said, "Dukes, people with schoolrooms and sisters and portraits of their mothers and reasons for being the way they are that turn out to be—" She stopped again. He said, "What?" She said, "Good. The reasons turn out to be good." He said, "You thought I was dangerous." She said, "Everyone said you were dangerous." He said, "And now?" She looked at him in the doorway of her rooms in his riding clothes, with London behind him, and thought about a girl of 8 bent over a copybook, and a boy who nodded at a Duke like they were equals, and a man who had shown her the truth of himself before she had given him a single reason to trust her. She said, "Now I think they were warning the wrong person." He said, "Yes, I rather think they were." He was not a man who reached for things quickly. She had understood that about him within the first hour. He was a man who waited until he was certain, and then was entirely certain, and did not second-guess it afterward. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Outside, London went about its business, entirely indifferent to the fact that in a set of rooms above a quiet street, the most dangerous woman in the city had just been undone by a man with a schoolroom and 43 children and amber eyes that had been warm, she now understood, from the very first moment she walked into his study and told him the truth. The Varnmore Educational Foundation was formally established the following spring. By that summer, it had expanded to 2 additional locations in the valley, funded by a combination of the Duke's resources and a number of private donors who had read the Gazette notice and found themselves, to their own mild surprise, moved by it. The 3 land development partners found in the months following their letter to the Duke that their own arrangements were subjected to the level of scrutiny that they had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. Several contracts were renegotiated. One arrangement was dissolved entirely by a party who said only they had received new information and wished to reconsider. No one could trace it back to anyone. Mr. Fitch, when asked, said he had no idea what anyone was talking about. Maren Cole did not return to her previous work. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the particular skills she had spent 10 years developing, the ability to move through rooms unnoticed, to find what people were concealing, to understand the gap between appearance and reality, were considerably more useful applied to the protection of things worth protecting than to their exposure.
She was, as it turned out, very good at that, too. Lady Cecily, when informed of the developments, said only that she had told Alaric years ago that the right person would be someone unexpected, and that she was very glad to have been right, and slightly annoyed that no one had listened to her sooner. The Duke said he had listened. He had simply been waiting. Cecily said, "You are always waiting." He said, "Not anymore." In the schoolroom on the east side of Varnmore Park, a girl of 8 years old was learning to read. She did not know the name of the woman who had, through a series of events she would never fully understand, made certain that the school she attended would still be there next year, and the year after, and the year after. She was simply learning to read, which, in the end, was exactly the point. Everyone said the Duke of Varnmore was dangerous. They were not entirely wrong, but the most dangerous thing about him was not his wealth, or his influence, or the cold precision with which he managed both. It was the schoolroom, the 43 children, the absolute, unwavering, completely non-negotiable refusal to let the world stay exactly as it was. No one had warned Maren Cole about that, and by the time she understood it, she had already decided she was not going anywhere.